So I mean, for me, anthropology is really kind of like, because obviously it's the study of people, and there's many different disciplines that are studying people in that way, but it's really like the study of human relationships, and I think that's what it comes down to, and the ways humans organize through these relationships.
Anthropology is for me about kind of doing ethnography, which is kind of hanging out with people, living with people in a very personal way, kind of being part of something, right? Something that's happening on the ground, and not getting like deterred by like abstract arguments or something like that, but starting from what are actually people doing, what are they up to, and kind of thinking about that, right? So for an example, what you're doing in East Town, what people are up to, look at what they're doing, and the conversation starts there.
When you look into like the history of Newham as a borough, or East Ham in this case as a neighborhood, what you can really see is migration is pretty much, or like diversity, or is pretty much commonplace, right?
Yeah.
So you see many different generations have arrived here, and it is something that most people here have a relationship to, right?
Has it always been like this? So like, part of my life was like, I spent a lot of time growing up in East Ham when I was young.
Right.
But has it always been like this? Has it always been like loads of like South Asian communities and Sri Lankans and Indians, and now also increasing like Eastern European, Central European population as well? Has it always been like this, or when did this come about, this kind of shift?
As far as I can see, there's like two places that are quite central to how East Ham, specifically here as a neighborhood, has evolved. And that's on the one side, the docks in kind of like the south of the borough here.
Right.
And then the rail works, Stratford Works, in the northeast of the borough.
Yeah.
And I think specifically in the 19th century was when, the trade from the former colonies, or from the then colonies, was at its highest. So there were lots of people, specifically from Bangladesh, who were working on the tea trade, and those people would spend significant time also in England, in London, down in the docks, right?
That's really interesting, because like, migration is always, in Daily Mail and all these papers, right-wing papers, it's always kind of like, oh, these migrants are coming here for no reason at all. Like, or they're coming to take this thing that we've built that's amazing, and they want our like all these things that we have already. But it's kind of interesting, like, looking at the history, it's kind of what Stuart Hall talks about, like, we're here because you were there.
Right.
Right. And what you're saying is, if we look at the history, it's maybe like, it's colonization that has resulted in like, like going to the Caribbean to connect sugar, and like going to India, Sri Lanka to collect tea. Is kind of those populations, like, and that makes it, I guess, like, history is so important to that. So you work here at the renewal program, right?
I do, yeah.
So, and you work in migration and migration study, and you're an anthropologist.
That's true, yeah.
So can you explain what you're doing here?
Right. So at the moment, I'm working on a project that is trying to look into kind of like how people find support when they're very newly arrived. And so part of that, what I'm trying to do with the research is I try to do it through volunteering. So I support kind of like different civil society organizations. I work with a primary school. And so the idea is kind of like to get to know these places from the inside, and kind of like build meaningful kind of like relationships with people in there, and see what they have to say. What this project here is trying to do, and specifically with this approach of what we call arrival infrastructures, is trying to look at it from a different angle, right? To look at it from an angle of like kind of the networks that are already existing, rather than trying to conceptualize the migrants themselves, right? It's really looking into like the experience of somebody who's new to the neighborhood, right? Who are the first people that they get into contact with, who might be supporting them, who might not be, So I think that's really the idea of looking at it from that angle. I think what we're trying to not find out, but what we're trying to explore is like, is it actually easier than to arrive into a place where many different generations have already arrived too, you know?
Yeah.
Not necessarily from your own country or linguistic group.
And when they come, they know where to shop, which is at these kind of like, I'm not advertising this particular cash and carry, but I remember when my aunt came here from Sri Lanka, her son was already living here. He was the first migrant. He came when he was like, you know, older, 18. And, you know, she would come here and just be amazed that there were like all these things that you could buy in Sri Lanka. And just were like, you know, we'd be able to cook exactly what we want. Whereas like my parents that lived in like an area that wasn't like this, it was kind of difficult to go to Tesco's and be like, it's just kind of nice that everyone knew what she was doing. Like, oh yeah, you're here to support your son. And that's very normal. Like everyone's aware of that life trajectory even. And I think it was like the Asian people that were aware of it, also the non-Asian people seem to be aware of it as well. Of the few that were here at the time.
The ethnographic approach helps a lot. When you're trying, for example, with ethnography, because you're building these like deeper relationships over a longer time, a deeper engagement with the neighborhood, with the people. I think you go away from these ideas of describing things through a migrant lens, and you come closer to kind of like just describing the day-to-day activities of people, and you come to some very different conclusions or some very different descriptions, you know?
I think that's what is powerful about, like, you know, what ethnography is, right? Ethnography is like this fancy term. It's just like kind of hanging out with people, living with people, and just spending a lot of time with them, I guess. And the kind of more time you spend with them, the more you realize actually that the representation of like how things are represented in the newspapers or how things are represented in like right-wing pamphlets, you kind of realize that, oh, actually, this is not what it is.
There's lots of anthropological work, which is like, you know, how communities created around food, you know, and how it produces those kind of like, you know, bonds, just by trying to find the same restaurant. But I feel like that's an interesting thing, right? Because what you can also see on East Ham on the High Street, there's a very regional focus, right? So there is that part of the High Street where you have lots of places that offer kind of like South Indian cuisine, right? And then the northern part has more Bengali, Bangladeshi food places, right? So I think that's also quite interesting because there is a proliferation, right? There's quite a lot of these places, and I think in rather newly arrived communities or communities that are not yet kind of like at this level where they have a civil society organization that you know works for them, or maybe they have someone from that language group represented on the council level, etc. You know, so for example with the Romanian communities, you can see that's still like in the making. There's still there's no Romanian speaking councilor in Newham, even though the population is huge. And there's Roma support groups, but for example there's not a Romanian kind of like institution that represents Romanians here at that level, you know. So but then the shops really become hubs, you know, and they really become that almost like as they become that institution, because people are saying, oh, you need help, go to that shop, you know, they will help you. What I come across here is like there's really I mean, we're looking into like the kind of like interactions between the different communities here, right? And there seem to be these like bonds of solidarity, you know, and they sometimes go beyond the boundaries of a community, you know, so ethno-linguistic communities, etc. And you see, for example, at the renewal program, one of the things there is that it doesn't matter if you're newly arrived or if you're, you know, like, but people come together for a reason, and that is to help, right?
That's kind of part of what like life is, kind of just experience those complexity. Like, you know, when people come back from wars, they experience trauma, and the community supports them. I think like in an unequal world, you know, where it's becoming increasingly unequal, there's this kind of, you are going to need to support people, and that's never going to be always rosy, right?
We could talk all day, and I think that has been very well documented, the kind of like austerity and lack of support structures and kind of like lack of services, etc. But I guess when talking about arrival, you also necessarily will talk about agency, you know, We will talk about what people are actually doing in order, what kind of strategies they have to counteract that. Because yeah, I think it's really looking into the kind of like creative potential of the communities and also of individuals to yeah, create these networks of support. You have some shopkeepers here who have very interesting knowledge about the area, and that very much apart from selling things, they're also yeah, lending their support to people, you know. And I think one of the things that is quite important is that like these formal structures can actually learn quite a lot from the informal, right? So you can learn quite a lot of like how people are available in a more informal setting instead of building this like big apparatus with lots of bureaucracy, you know. So you can really like humanize almost the support that's given. And I think, I mean, at the end, and this might be like a very anthropological thing to say, right? But it's down to the relationship you have with someone, you know. So, and I think that's really important when it comes down to the informal and where the formal can really learn from it. Is it comes down to building these meaningful relationships, and that's why people come back, and that's why people walk into the front door and kind of like yeah, getting that support is because they trust a person, you know. What do you enjoy most about being an anthropologist?
I like the mixture of paying attention to kind of empirical detail and the unique tools it gives me to think through yeah, just paying attention to what people are up to, right? And I'm just curious about people, and I don't want to read it through a philosophical debate that's detached from them. I don't want to read it on the paper saying like, here are some migrants flooding into the country. I want to kind of like look at like what's actually happening and what people are up to. And it's kind of, I always find it fascinating when actually what's happening on the ground is quite often different to how people are putting it, and realizing that is kind of fascinating.
I mean, for me, it's kind of because I think I had lots of these thoughts and kind of like observations before ever knowing what anthropology is, or before thinking about what anthropology is, and it gives it an outlet, you know. So it's kind of like this knowledge that is produced by being in the world and by observing and putting things into comparisons, which I think, and we've talked about this before, right? I think it's something that is beyond the academic spectrum. It's something human, you know. I think everybody does it. Maybe not everybody theorizes it in the same way or publishes it in the same way or voices it even in the same way. But I think observing, comparing, thinking about what people in your surroundings go through and what's on their mind is something very human, you know?
Yeah, yeah, it does, yeah, that's a good way to say it. Yeah, it does feel very human.